So there was one more thing I wanted to talk about from our article on Caribbean sexuality, and then we'll leap into talking about Franz Fannon, who I think what were people's reactions to the Franz Fannon article, by the way? Was that interesting for people, or did you just find him confusing compared to some of our other readings? That much of a reaction. Did people actually read the Franz Fannon article? What's that?
You're talking about the Sullivan?
Yeah, the Sullivan article. Yeah, it's on Franz Fannon, so yeah. Did people actually read that, or I'm just looking for it's better if I know. You can be honest. I'm not gonna like chastise you, run you out of the classroom, or something like that. Did people actually get a chance to read it? We posted it late, so don't feel like. Did people not get a chance to read it? Yeah. Okay, that's fine. Changes how I should present it, right? Like, okay, so but do on normal instances make sure you're keeping up with the readings, right? So, because it'll be a lot harder to fill out the next take home, right, if you're not keeping up with the readings. So, and a lot of times I feel like people lose points solely because they haven't been doing that. So, so don't fall into that trap. Just because I don't have regular assessments doesn't mean to let it slide. So, on page 250, I wanted to talk about. There's this one section where it talks about the Caribbean sex workers that starts with studies of sex work. Do you guys see where I'm at? Do people need a second to get their document up? We're on the Sharp article. The sweetest taboo. You guys see where I'm at? Okay, cool. 250. So this paragraph that starts studies of sex work. Somebody want to jump in? Maybe somebody who we normally don't hear from. How about you, Nathan? You want to jump in?
Sure.
Cool.
Studies of sex work in the Caribbean belong to the growing scholarship on the global spread of sex tourism since the late 1980s. As small third world nations have become increasingly debt-ridden, they have entered into competition with another one for the hard currency that tourism provides. Beverly Mullings makes a case for the rise of sex tourism in Jamaica being linked, if only informally, to the national policies on flexible tourism developed since the 1980s. 20 years of structural adjustments and the elimination of preferred markets from Jamaica's bauxite and bananas have led to tourism being a major earner of foreign currency. In today's competitive market, the explicit marketing of all-inclusive super resorts as places for uninhibited sex increases the demand for sex tourism. As sex has become part of the exotic fantasies that destinations around the world offer tourists, sex tourism has grown to become a multi-billion-dollar industry. The ease with which the global north can consume the bodies of black and brown-skinned men and women is linked to a transnational economy in which Caribbean nations are transformed into service-oriented labor centers for Europe, the United States, and Canada.
Okay, thank you. So what's changing here, right? So like we have this rise in sex tourism. What is this paragraph connecting it to? And we start just vaguely needle our way into something more precise. What's changing around Jamaica that causes this to happen? Because as we talked about, like people don't like being in the sex trade, right? If they could be in other industries, they probably would. What's changed in Jamaica?
Like the elimination of their preferred markets.
Yeah, so that's one. It references, and we can just, markets. There's other things that, yeah, so it's going to be economic differences. So then we see some of the other ones. There's a few references to economics in this paragraph. When somebody sees one, just holler out. Good way to go about it is if you look for words you don't really know.
National policies on flexible tourism.
Flexible tourism. Okay, what else? Looking for two more things. Going back to like if you just look through for things you don't know what they are. Yeah.
Marketing super resorts as a place for sex.
Oh yeah, so the super resorts are just these all-inclusive resorts, right? So like that was one of the things I'm pointing at, but essentially like that's part of. So the things that it's explaining, right? It's explaining super resorts, which include essentially the fulfillment of exotic sexual fantasies. That's a lot more all-inclusive than most of us think about when we think about visiting hotels.
Maybe transnational economy.
Transnational economy. One more. Starts with an S.
Structural adjustment.
Structural adjustment policies. All of these things are referring to economic changes since the 1980s. Or more aptly, starting in the 1980s. So we spent a lot of time talking about colonialism, right? We haven't spent any time talking about something called neocolonialism. And so, so just to refresh our memory, when did official colonialism, where governments are holding other territories via military power, when did that end? You guys remember? It was after World War II, right? The UN decided that colonialism was inhumane and should be ended, right? And since then, countries have decolonized, right? So countries have let go of their colonies. Either they were forced to by the local population, or they simply gave up the territory. But there's sort of an irony that if we were to compare most countries in the world to where they were at in the 1960s, they're actually poorer than they were. So the question is like, why? And so why is it that we see this? And one of the explanations would be that we exist in something called neocolonialism. So as we talked about before, what was colonialism about? What were Western countries trying to do under colonialism? It's been a few weeks.
Get resources from other countries.
Yeah, so it's a resource extraction regime. That's what we refer to it as, right? Neocolonialism is also a resource extraction regime. but it works a little bit differently. So basically the idea is that colonialism didn't end, it just changed. In a lot of ways we now have colonialism that's cheaper for Western countries, but has pretty much the same outcome as original colonialism. And how this happened is through an alteration of markets, which is what all this is kind of referring to. So starting in the 1980s, there was something that happened in the 1970s that was really important. So as countries, as governments were letting go of their colonies, countries were encouraged to develop. And to develop, they were encouraged to take out loans, right? Just like if you think about if you're going to make a business, right, what do? You take out loans and you use that money and you reinvest it, and then, essentially the idea is that it comes back to you, right? And you actually make more money. The same thing was, the idea was if governments could get fairly inexpensive loans, right, then what could happen is they could develop, road systems, they could develop, sewer systems, they could develop, forms of cheap energy, dams, things like that. And so countries did this. Then in the 1980s, there was an economic recession. It was something called stagflation. I'm not sure if you guys have ever heard of that. But essentially what happened is that, the economy tanked, but the interest rate rose. And this is where government loans that countries take out from just the countries that the agencies that give loans is the IMF, which stands for the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. Right. And so how these loans work is that governments front money to these banks. So essentially loaning governments, which would be like the United States and Western European countries, will front money to these banks. And then the banks will give loans to other countries. So, but these loans work differently than our personal loans. So you all are about to have a fair amount of debt, right? Finishing college up, right? Does anybody know what you do when you finish up here with your loans? You set a payment plan. Wherever you end at college, like that's your interest rate on your loan unless you refinance it somehow. Usually pretty low interest rates for college loans, right? By the way, when you select repayment, only select income contingent repayment. It's the only thing you should ever do. Besides the point. But the point is like what happens if the interest rate goes up in the country after you take out a loan? What happens to the interest rate on your loan? Does anybody know this? Same with the house loan, same with the car loan. Unless you get some really bad loans. It stays the same, right? This is not how international loans work. So when the interest rates skyrocketed across the world in the late 1970s, what happened is that country's debt ballooned. So, a country may have taken out $2 million to build a dam, but now all of a sudden they owe $10 million to the World Bank. So a lot of countries no longer were capable of even paying the interest on their loans, let alone paying back the principal. So countries' debt just grew and grew and grew and grew and grew. Those countries are still in the same position today. They haven't actually paid off any of their debt. Their debt is actually larger than it was before. But initially, the idea was the IMF and the World Bank were like, we need to get countries to do things that are going to make them able to pay off their loans. Right? What resulted was something called structural adjustment. It's sometimes also called conditionalities. And this is also very different from a personal loan. So if you take out a loan, can the bank place conditions on you after the fact? Can the bank change the rules of your loan? No, but internationally they can. And so what structural adjustment was they were essentially like, okay, now since you owe us money, you have to do X, Y, and Z, right? And there's two things that they usually, structural adjustment had you do. They had you do various things within your country to reduce the size of your government. This is referred to as austerity. So you do things to reduce the size of your government, and then you do things to open markets. So those are the two things that happen. And these can be pretty dramatic cuts that they ask for. So like when I was in Senegal, it was against the conditionality of their loans to repair any sewer systems. So their sewer system, even though the cities had, like Dakar, had probably tripled in size since the 1960s, they were functioning off of the exact same sewer system. They weren't allowed to update their power grid, so they had roving blackouts that would last for hours, that would just move from neighborhood to neighborhood. Actually, that's really common. Has anybody ever been to a country outside of Western Europe and the US? This is actually really common. Because of conditionalities, a lot of people don't have modern electrical systems, which means that they essentially have to have constant roving blackouts throughout their cities. It's against the conditionality of the loans of Senegal to set up trash services. So people just have to burn all their trash in the street, which is particularly hygienic, right? They try to put, and actually like a lot of countries in Africa have conditionalities on their loan that they're not allowed to provide medical services in any way, shape, or form, which actually contributed to the spread of AIDS in sub-Saharan Africa. Senegal actually did set up medical stuff and got threatened to be embargoed by the UN because they set up medical things to fight the spread of AIDS, right? So these can sometimes be really harsh. If you're talking about, do you think of it as against the rules for your government to fight the spread of AIDS, do you think that has a positive or negative impact on you economically over time? What do you think? It has a negative impact on you over time, right? So in essence, what happens is structural adjustment greatly reduced the standard of living worldwide, right? Which we're still living in. So that's one thing that happened as a result of it. So people live in more dire situations partially because, and a lot of governments, so getting back to like the idea of it being colonialism, right? So there's a lot of governments in the world where 20 to 30% of the money taken in by their government in terms of taxes goes directly out to the United States or Western Europe, right? So like good chunks of the country's actual functioning budget, right? And in some countries, good chunks of their actual gross domestic product goes directly into funding governments in other countries. So a lot of the money that our government functions off of in the United States are taken directly from peripheral countries, what we used to call third world countries when we had a second world. So basically, like, so poorer countries often fund the governments of wealthier countries, right? Which you can see, right? That's exactly like a form of resource extraction. Then the other thing is that they have to open their markets up, which means that they have to privatize national resources. So this could be that the government has to sell off land to the highest bidder. The governments have to sell off, things like forest to the highest bidder. There's even things like, one of the examples of something that's more extreme is countries have sometimes been forced to sell off their water rights, or at least certain regions they sell off their water rights so that the government no longer owns the water. Have you heard of this?
Yeah.
Did I talk about this already? Okay. Yeah, so a good example was, they tried to do this in Guatemala, but the people fought against it. But essentially, like, a third party takes up the ownership of the water in the country and then charges people fees. How they decide to do that is often under conditionality, can't really be regulated by the actual home government. So, like, they could just deplete the entire water resource of the country, turn it into something saline, right? So that the groundwater is now salt water. That's perfectly legal, right? So there's whole places that that's occurred in. They also do things like in parts of the Transvaal in South Africa, they charge farmers for rainwater. So whenever it rains, they send them bills in the mail that they have to pay this third-party corporation that owns the water. Because technically that water that fell from the sky has been privatized. It's not a public resource anymore, right? Also, like, water can be used for dumping and stuff like that as well. So the point is like, by opening markets, what happens is something that before the government could at least say. So, like, in the United States, like, if you're going to open some sort of, like, massive well, the government at least has the ability to tell you yes or no, right? In other countries, under the conditionalities of the law, they have no such rights. What happens if you don't meet your conditionality is then you are embargoed by the UN and no one can trade with you anymore. So basically, countries are caught between being exploited and being completely ostracized from markets, right? This is the context in which, so, like, back to the initial question, what that paragraph is pointing to is, like, so why? You know, if when they the various studies have kind of shown that people don't particularly like doing sex work, right? And that you have all these men and women in the Caribbean being forced into, basically fulfilling the exotic sexual fantasies of white patrons. Why does this occur? It occurs because countries have so little control over what they can and cannot provide, right? Countries have so little control over their own economics that this becomes, and because of the wealth inequality is growing between countries, right, this becomes a feasible thing. So if you want to understand the sex trade is, because of globalization, people being brought in closer proximity, but also because of globalization, right, because this is a process of globalization. Also because our globalization is neo-colonial globalization. Those people are brought into closer proximity, but they're more and more unequal, which allows this hierarchy to have more, essentially manipulate people's actions more over time. That's the last argument I wanted to kind of pull out of that article. It takes a little sussing, right, because there's quite a bit to it. So questions or thoughts people have on this? So, yeah, go ahead.
What is conditionality?
So those are the conditionalities are the rules,
Oh.
right? So the structural adjustment and conditionalities are kind of the same thing. This also, just to sort of step back from this too, like, why do we normally want to explain other countries as being poor? What's the explanation most people want to give for this? Why are poor countries poor? In, like, calming, colloquial, everyday explanations.
They're just not advanced enough.
Yeah. Yeah, so the argument often will go, if they were more included, if they were more advanced, right, then they would essentially be wealthier and more prosperous and so on and so forth. When in reality, like, what we're doing is actually forcing people into a situation, countries into a situation where they're impoverished. And a lot of this sort of stuff gets supported under the language of that you're developing the nation, right? By opening their markets and reducing their government, we're developing them. It was the language of it. That's how the IMF and the World Bank talked about it, right? But in a lot of ways, it wasn't development. It was just exploitation. This continues to this day. Even though officially the IMF and the World Bank, like, their statements are structural adjustment doesn't work. We're making countries poorer. They acknowledge that, right? But they're beholden upon the loaning countries. And the loaning countries say that they have to continue it. Some countries have forgiven international debt, but not very, I think Greenland did, I think, was like the only one I'm aware of. But by and large, yeah, they're beholden onto them to continue the policies. Do you guys see the link between colonialism and neocolonialism? Do you see kind of the similarity? So yeah, the idea is a lot of scholars are like, colonialism just looked like it ended. And in fact, this is a lot cheaper because you no longer have to like station thousands of soldiers in other countries to like keep the peace or anything like that. You can just simply take the resources and leave. Other questions or thoughts people have? Welcome to sociology, where you learn something depressing every day. Oh, by the way, I should say something about this. The Sociology Club is going to begin meeting again, so if people are interested, you do not have to be a sociologist to join. It's at 3:45 today at Benedetto's. I just found out about it this week myself, so. Okay, cool. Any questions about this at all? Let's talk about Franz Fannon. So Franz Fannon, originally I had assigned a more kind of catch-all on psychoanalytic perspectives on race. And I replaced that reading because I couldn't get the scanner working with this reading, which is specifically on who's the most important psychoanalyst who talks about race, which is Franz Fannon. I don't normally talk about authors' biographies, but it actually makes sense for Franz Fannon because I think it provides a lot of context. So I know quite a few of you didn't get to the reading. Did anybody get to the reading and catch any of Franz Fannon's biography? So Franz Fannon is from Martinique. Do people know where Martinique is? It's in the Caribbean. It's an island. It used to be a French colony. When he lived there, it was a French colony. So Franz Fannon grows up in Martinique. He moves to France to go to medical school. And while working on his medical degree, he writes one of his most famous books, which is White Skin, Black Mask, or sorry, Black Skin. I'm looking at the wrong article. Okay. Black Skin, White Mask. Which we'll get into some of the details of the argument about black skin, white mask, particularly about the unconscious. And then afterwards, he ends up running hospitals in North Africa. And then the Algerian War breaks out. He becomes a major revolutionary figure in the Algerian War for Independence in the 50s. And then in 1961, at least, depends on who you talk to, he was assassinated by the US government when he came on as a UN delegate. So he was, the file's not open on Franz Fannon, but it appears possibly that he was poisoned by the CIA. So that's his history, right? Which is kind of a weird and scattered history. And it's particularly this sort of movement between these different places that sort of sets the context for what he writes. Actually, this is very common for, and you've probably picked up on this a little bit with Collins even. It's very common for theorists of race to talk about their personal experiences, right? So that's why it's sort of useful to know that. Because in particular, White Skin, Black Mask is about Franz Fanon's experience of coming from Martinique, which is predominantly black, like to the point where he doesn't really think about being black, to all of a sudden being in France and being treated very differently and thinking very differently about his body and his race. Okay. Let's check the time. I haven't checked it in a while. It's not good. Let's start with, and I think it's probably useful just to read some of these sections aloud. So let's start with this paragraph on page 10. It's right under the subheading, ethical slippages in shattered horizons and zebra stripings. So when I get a volunteer to read.
Starting with one of the primary.
Yep.
One of the primary goals of Fannon's Black Skin, White Masks is to analyze the formation and effects of the zebra striping of the mind, of black people like himself. Fannon was a French citizen who grew up on the Antillean island of Martinique, who visited France for the first time as a young adult. More to the point, Fannon was a black Frenchman who grew up in a predominantly black world, never noticing that he was black, and indeed unconsciously thinking of himself as white, until he traveled to the predominantly white world of continental France. It was this world traveling, as Maria Lugones has called it, that zebra-striped Fannon's psyche. His wholly white unconscious fractured into black and white parts, transforming a relatively peaceful, unified, which is not to say unproblematic space, into one that was at war with itself.
So what is Franz Fanon describing here? First of all, psychoanalytic parts of the mind. Do people know these? What is the unconscious? So we have a conscious mind. And in our conscious mind, I think that's supposed to be you. Yeah. In our conscious mind is basically the things we're aware of, right? So the things we know, can talk about, right? Then we have pre-conscious. Our pre-conscious mind are things that we don't necessarily like articulate and know on the surface, like we don't immediately know, but we have access to it. If we think about something, right? So like, if I think about, I don't know, like the way in which it could be things like you aren't aware of like how you walk, right? But then somebody points something out, and then all of a sudden you become very aware of it, right? So pre-conscious are things that you have access to that you're kind of aware of in a pre-linguistic way. Make sense? And then unconscious, our unconscious mind are these sort of deep underlying things that we're not very aware of at all, right? That provide sort of the basis of our experiences. So Franz Fanon is really he's one of the primary theorists of white privilege. So he wants to understand how is it that minorities' experiences of themselves and their bodies is different from the assumed world of whiteness, right? The way in which white people have a security in their world and their way of thinking about themselves that other people do not. So that's his major point. So how do we see that in this paragraph? What is he pointing to? And particularly has to do with how the unconscious works. Look through it and see what you find. Just to reiterate, page 10 is our paragraph that we're looking at right now. Yeah?
And when it talks about him unconsciously thinking of himself as white.
Yeah. So Franz Fannon thinks that the unconscious is that African Americans actually think of themselves, or not African Americans, sorry, we could call them, that people of African descent, black people, secretly have a white unconscious through which they interpret themselves. Right? That's his idea. So while, on a conscious level, they identify as being black, he's going to claim on an unconscious level that people have a certain amount of whiteness. Now, he's going to make a big deal about things being different in certain places. One thing that doesn't come through in the article is that Franz Fannon is going to say that this isn't actually true of African Americans, because African Americans understand themselves in contrast to white people more because they live in a place that's predominantly white. In particular, he's talking about people from the colonies. So it's sort of like if you exist in a sub-Saharan African country, or if you exist in Martinique, right, you're very likely living in a place where 90+% of your population is black. So you might not really be super aware of your own blackness, but as we'll see, there's reasons why he says that their subconscious is white. Just on the surface, and this is worth pointing out before we move forward, for Franz Fannon, basically what he's doing, and you'll see this, is he's taking ideas from psychoanalysis and ideas from something called phenomenology, which we'll talk about what that is. And then he's showing that you can't understand it outside of racialized hierarchies that pervade it. That's his point, right? So in a lot of ways, he wants to claim that the world of psychoanalysis, or the world of phenomenology, are worlds that actually speak to the white privilege of those who came up with the ideas. That's his overarching point. So let's go to page 11. Let's go to the "but first." You guys read that paragraph aloud. Yeah, go ahead.
But first we must ask how a world such as the Antilles, predominantly populated by black bodies, could produce inhabitants who unconsciously think of and pre-reflectively experience themselves as white. The answer, Fannon tells us, is that an ethical slippage occurred in which the moral values of white France were transferred into black Martinique. The French Western European value system dictates that black is bad, immoral, and sinful, while white is good, virtuous, and pure. To the extent that one sees herself as a morally upstanding person, she therefore must be white. As Fannon explains, if I order my life like that of a moral man, I simply am not a Negro. When implemented into Martinique, the French Western European value system did not explicitly biologize its values. White and black were understood by Antillians as labels for virtues and flaws unrelated to skin color, which is why Fannon can retrospectively say from the perspective of his young self that racial color is nothing. I do not even notice it. I know only one thing, which is the purity of my conscience and the whiteness of my soul.
So what is he saying? What is Franz Fannon saying? In a wonderfully strange psychoanalytic way. What happens in colonialism to spaces that are not predominantly white? Particularly what happens to their value structures? How much of the original culture of places that are colonized stuck around? You guys familiar with this with like indigenous peoples in general?
There's not a lot.
What's that?
There's not a lot left. Like it changes. They portray what they want onto the like indigenous people that haven't changed.
Yeah. Essentially, like the cultures get sort of systematically destroyed. What do they get replaced with?
The beliefs of the colonizers that want to.
Yeah. And so, like when Franz Fanon is talking about the introduction of the belief of the colonizer, first of all, like Martinique, like does anybody know where the African population of the Caribbean come from? Were they there originally? Does anybody know what happened to the indigenous? This is a poignant week to talk about this. Does anybody know what happened to the indigenous population in the Caribbean? For the most part, they're killed, right? This starts from the very first moment that Westerners come to the Caribbean. And in fact, the Caribbean is named after a group of people called the Carib, which is actually where we get the word cannibal from, because Columbus thought they were cannibals, which they probably weren't. There's no like archaeological record that they were. But essentially, he kills all the Carib before leaving, right? So like even our name of the region comes from a supposedly cannibalistic group of people that are murdered in mass in a genocide. The very first interaction between Western culture and that location, right? That doesn't happen with every indigenous population in the Caribbean. You have sort of mixed populations, mixed in, right? But essentially, what happens to replace that labor? How did we replace Indian labor in North America? Makes us look different than other colonies. We imported it from where? Slavery. Slavery was essentially the solution. So the island of Martinique, in a lot of ways, was at one point a slave island, right? Which is why it's predominantly black. Okay. So what is Franz Fanon saying about the values in a place like Martinique? What do Western values teach them?
That white is good and black is bad.
Yeah, essentially. That it teaches them the philosophy of racial hierarchy, right? Which to some degree, because there are no like white people on the island, they absorb without wholly thinking about it, right? So he's saying in places, colonies where people are predominantly black, because they've had a different value system forced upon them, right, have to see the world via a Western perspective. So they understand their own blackness within these categories, right? But they're not biologized categories, right? So they're not thinking about biological difference because their population is so homogeneous. So instead, what does Franz Fanon claim that how do they understand whiteness and blackness? What's the difference? This is where you get to where it starts quoting him. In the middle of this paragraph, as Franz Fanon explains.
It's like about like your inner self and like your virtue and stuff.
Yeah, so essentially it becomes, if he's and he's claiming this is an unconscious thing, so people wouldn't say this, right? But in their mind, his claim is that people, if they consider themselves good people, they will think of themselves as white, right? That whiteness and blackness becomes attached to the lives people live, rather than their actual biological. That's why he says it isn't biologized, right? So in his mind, like if he lives a clean, upright, and also like there's some hierarchical stuff with class, right? People associate poor people in these places with being black, wealthier people with being white, right? As well as like if you're, on the island of Martinique and you act very French and you dress very French and you eat the right food and you act the right way and you have the right mannerisms and you speak proper French, then you'll think of yourself as white, which essentially is what Franz Fanon is, right? Franz Fanon is a wealthy person from Martinique. Otherwise, you don't get to go to medical school in the Sorbonne without being wealthy, right? So you know, from that perspective, he grew up never thinking of himself as black, but thinking about other people in the islands. In the overall book, he talks about also like that even poorer people on the island of Martinique will talk disparagingly about people from Africa. They'll talk about people from Africa and call them savages, right? Which is sort of ironic, right? And so he's picking up on this weird irony of this internal hierarchy that occurs within predominantly black countries. Okay, so I'm going to have you guys jump down to, because this gives a little more explanation of how we get to this state, right, of unconsciously thinking one's white. If you go down to it's the last full paragraph on page 11 where it says Fannon provides. You guys see where I'm at? Can I get a new volunteer? Preferably somebody who hasn't talked yet today. You've talked today. Who hasn't talked yet today? You guys know who you are. You haven't talked yet today, have you? You wanna tap? What's up?
No.
Go ahead anyways. This is my new trick. I'm gonna make people read if they don't talk. It's an incentive to be more vocal. Go ahead.
No, I don't really have the article right now.
You don't have the article up?
No.
Okay. Somebody who has the article up. Don't be embarrassed. If you haven't talked yet, I haven't made you read yet. How about Lauren? It's Lauren, right?
Yeah, I'm still trying to get there.
Okay. You're very shy, aren't you? Did I embarrass you? No, not you. Did I embarrass you?
No,
Okay.
good.
Do you have the article up?
Not yet.
Not yet. Silence. Amanda, how about you? Or not Amanda, I just called you by your mother's name. Jordan.
Where are we? The Fannon provides specific.
11, yeah, Fannon provides specific.
Okay. Fannon provides specific examples of some of the ways in which the Antillean collective unconscious is formed by this ethnical slippage. History textbooks, songs, and especially magazines and movies are the primary vehicles for the transference of France to Martinique, according to Fannon. Black school children in the Antilles are taught to identify with our ancestors, the Gauls, which meant that they were taught to identify with the French truth that posits the black people as savages in the European Enlightenment. Movies such as Tarzan teach the same lesson and encourage black children to identify with the white conqueror over the black savage. Fanning is especially critical of magazines and comic books that are devoured by the local children, and in which the wolf, the devil, the evil spirit, the bad man, the savage are always symbolized by numbers or Indians. These publications are put together by white men for little white men. And yet, because they are distributed in the Antilles, they also impact little white boys and black girls who come to see themselves as part of the Antillean whiteness.
Okay, so what's the mechanism that that Fannon's describing here? What makes black people in other countries unconscious white? What are some of the examples? What are the examples of the things he's talking about here? Literally the things we've learned too.
So it's like the education system, music, basically everything that infiltrates its way into the culture. Makes people think differently.
Yeah, the culture flows from in this case France to Martinique, right? So if they sit down and they read a textbook, the textbook's written from whose perspective? from a French perspective. This is the reference is the Gaul, right? Like Gauls are like the ancient ancestors of French, right? So, you know, just in the subtle language of it, a French textbook is going to say things like, our ancestors, the Gauls, right? So they're going to learn to identify with, in the same way you can make an argument that in our own schools, right? Minorities learn to identify with the people who held them as slaves or killed off their people, right? You know, our history is like taught in an inclusive way, but it's not actually an inclusive history. It's a history that for most people is a brutal fact, right? Or not most people, for many people in this country was a brutal fact, right? Same thing with being French, right? What are some of the other examples? So one of the examples he gives is textbooks. What are the other examples that he gives? Yeah.
Magazines and comic books.
Magazines, comic books. Did you have songs, movies, right? And all these things are racialized, right? So basically, like, people become haunted with, like, basically to identify with themselves, right? They have to identify with the villains of stories, right? Not with the protagonists. Do you guys see where this is? And even to this day, we could say, like, you turn on the TV, you think about stuff like cop shows. Who are the villains most of the time in cop shows? They're Hispanic, they're black, right? They're covered in tattoos, they're right, like they're a specific minority group, and then if you have a positive portrayal of African people, African American, people of African descent in a cop show, there's usually some super clean cut person who basically looks white, right? That's teaching this exact same value as what Franz Fannon is, right? So an underlying Western value system is this idea that to be black is to be evil, and to be white is to be good. To be black is to be savage, to be white is to be civilized, right? Our portrayal of other countries follows much the same pattern as it did back when Franz Fannon was writing in the 1950s, right? You can think about, like, if we have a story that takes place in Africa, what is it usually like in Africa? Which is not what it's usually like in Africa. Not that we have that many stories in Africa, but when that does occur, it usually portrays it as this horribly violent place, right? Most of Africa at any given time is not violent, right? It's this sort of, but we have this idea, if we think about a place, we think of it as a place of disease, as a place of, like, right? So, like, if you consume nothing but Western culture predominates as cultural production, right? In the United States, most movies are produced in the United States. If they're not produced in the United States, they're generally produced in Europe, right? You get some being made other places, but not as much. So that flow of culture, what Franz Fannon is pointing out, basically forces people from a very early age to take on that white perspective. So this is his idea that essentially we have this sort of white unconscious as a result of that. So let's take from page 12 and go down to, there's a paragraph that starts with, now the zebra striping. I want to take it from the middle of that paragraph where it says, Fannon shows that for human beings. Anybody want to read?
Fannon shows that for human beings there is no such thing as being black in the way that a thing such as a chair is black. Being black is always a movement of becoming that is constituted by both self-understanding and others' perceptions upon. Coming to know yourself as black through others' perceptions of you does not, however, instantly change the white unconscious. Fannon insists that the deeply weighted unconscious is far too resilient for such quick transformation to occur. Instead, the painful agony that is the striking and splitting the unconscious begins. Having fully endorsed Franz's white supremacy, the black Antillean struggles to find a way to also affirm his or her newly discovered blackness. For such a person, traveling to a white world thus is not just a geographical relocation from the Antilles to the European continent, it is also a disruption of the place that she occupies within her ethical worldview. For the relocated black Antillian, moral consciousness now implies a cognitism, a fraction of consciousness into a bright part and an opposing black part. In order to achieve morality, it is essential that the newly discovered black, the dark, the Negro, vanish from consciousness into unconscious. Hence, a Negro is forever in combat with unfinished.
Yeah. So the idea here is, and this gets us into, like I said, Franz Fanon is primarily kind of like a theorist of white privilege, right? So because for white people, right, essentially they're allowed to consume this value system without contradiction, right? Their conscience does not fracture, right? But how does that differ from African Americans, or sorry, people of African descent worldwide, according to Fannon? What's the different interaction between themselves? This is something we talked about in Collins in a positive way. For Fannon, it's something inherently negative. You guys remember the master-slave dialectic? What was the point of the master-slave dialectic? Yeah.
That although society wants to make it seem like the master would know more about the situation, the slave actually knows more because they know what it feels like to be oppressed and what the oppressor does.
Yeah, that they can see themselves from both sides at once, right? Which is treated as a positive thing in the master-slave dialectic. Franz Fanon's talking about the same thing, but he wants to claim it as something negative. Why is it negative rather than positive in this case? What's the downside to seeing the world through white eyes if you're black? According to Fannon. What happens to you? Essentially, you become divided into parts, right? So it's not that the parts fit together into a nice clean whole, right? It's that they stay divided. So his point is like, because people become in some way sort of unconsciously white and consciously black, they become in a constant state of sort of internal conflict, right? That is very different from the sort of privileged white consciousness where there is no internal conflict, right? That's his point. Okay. I think y'all are ready for a pause. Am I gathering it right? Some heavy stuff, right? So we'll pick up on Tuesday. We'll continue talking. We're going to talk about embodiment. If you get a chance, do read the article though before next class. Otherwise, have a good day.